it is, in our opinion, a bit of a hidden risk for a lot of engagers and potentially contractors as well, potentially agencies as well.
Absolutely.
Is it a contracted out service? Is it a managed service?
Yeah, MSP, which obviously means something very different.
How'd you
Statement
say
of
was
work. Yeah. So it doesn't really have a brand yet, does it?
No.
There's a big difference between is it a contracted out service and then is it inside or outside I-35. Have you had that difficult conversation where you're saying, hang on a minute, do you realise that you're taking on a significant amount of risk? Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Your Own Account with Qdos. I'm Seb Bailey.
I'm Sam Cox.
I'm Nicole.
And today we wanted to talk about contracted out services, which is a term which we are hearing increasingly, but it's also a term that is quite confusing to a lot of people. But it is something that HMRC is certainly looking at the moment, and it is, in our opinion, a bit of a hidden risk for a lot of engagers and potentially contractors as well, potentially agencies as well.
Absolutely.
So a good starting point is, what are contracted out services?
Yeah, so it depends on who you ask, I suppose. A lot of people have a different views as to what is considered to be a contracted out service, but essentially if we think about the work that a recruitment agency does and the services that they provide to a client is a provision of labour. So a client has a requirement for a particular role within their organisation. They go to that recruitment agency provides them with an individual. If that client actually has a specific requirement for a particular piece of work, so if we talk about from a technology perspective, they maybe have a need for perhaps like an architectural review needs to be done by some of their applications. They might go to a specialist consultancy firm and actually say to this consultancy firm, look, we actually would like you to do a root and branch review of our architecture within our organisation. We want it done by this period of time. Let us know how much it's going to cost. There's various stages and whatnot that we're going to have within that. Now, that consultancy will largely agree a particular fee for that client. They will likely break down that product into stages. There'll be key deliverables and milestones. There'll be financial risk on the client the service provider, the consultancy, to deliver that service to the client organisation. And ultimately that consultancy will decide itself how it chooses to resource it. So whether it's staff, whether they might bring in some third-party workers to support it, but essentially the client on the receiving end of that is in receipt of a service. They've asked for a particular piece of work to be undertaken, and that's what that supplier actually delivers back into the organisation. So that's a kind of high-level view of what it should be, and the should be is the important point in the context of IR35.
And I suppose the question is why are we talking about it in the context of IR35?
Well, I think it's probably because that ambiguity allows for a certain amount of abuse, for want of a better word, of that structure. So I think it's probably important just to hone in on the specific IR35 point here, is that under that model, the hirer of contingent labour would be the consultancy, not the recipient of that consultancy's services. That makes that consultancy responsible for the IR35 position of the contractor, doing a status determination, and the end recipient of those services doesn't have any kind of IR35 exposure or obligation if it's done legitimately. However, that structure is abusable by masking the fact that actually, in some cases, workers may be provided to that end client in the same way that they would be as a PSC contractor. They are there on a time and materials basis to provide a service in a role in the same way that a PSC normally would. And I think it was that obviously HMRC, when they focused on this last year, I think that was a case of addressing maybe a little bit of a gap in the initial off-payroll rules that allowed this sort of grey area to materialise.
Yeah, and I suppose abuse is quite a strong word, isn't it? But one of the issues is that we don't have any case law. There's no precedent for this. So there is an element of objectivity in trying to build up what a view of what a contracted out service is and isn't. And I suppose let's talk about what if we think about a genuine contracted out services. Let's talk about some of the key things that you would expect to see. If you were an engager who needs a new bit of software installing, building, integrating.
Yeah.
What are the key markers of a genuinely contracted out service?
Largely, the supplier is taking ultimate responsibility for the delivery of that particular service. So they are going to be not necessarily coming into the organisation in the way that a recruitment agency would place an individual worker, but they will be taking full ownership for the delivery of that. If it's an app, if a piece of software they're one building, they're taking full responsibility for that. They're taking the financial risk. It's on them to deliver it on time, in budget, and for them to appropriately resource it.
Yeah.
There will obviously be milestones largely within those types of projects, and financial penalties if you don't meet them, or if you haven't built a particular piece of the software to a particular specification. So the supplier having to an extent the autonomy and the responsibility to deliver the actual service is a key marker of that. If we're getting into some of the more kind of nitty gritty, there's a lot of consideration that needs to be around things like in the contractual position and how the services are actually delivered, ensuring that there's no kind of consideration around things just being on a time and materials basis and it's headcount or bums on seats that's part of the service provision that the client has, the supplier has ultimately responsibility for delivering that into the client organisation. And what's a pretty key thing to point out with this as well is similar to assessing IR35 status, when an organisation is looking at what is a genuinely contracted out service or what's good practice from a contracted out service, the working reality is just as important as the contractual position as well. So you can put all these lovely conditions in a contract, but if it actually transpires that it's just people that are being delivered and it's a resource provision, that's not going to make the cut as far as that assessment is actually concerned. And I think that beyond that, like I said, that kind of ownership for the client, I keep doing this today, the ownership for the supplier and the responsibility that they have to deliver that service end to end, the financial risk. We've talked a bit about this before in terms of organisations not considering the insurance position that they have if they say, right, well, actually, we're going to move into more of a consultancy space than a resource space, which is a tricky one. But yeah, the positive markings are offset by a lot of the negative markings in terms of what shouldn't be there as part of a contracted out service. But you're absolutely right, is that it creates this massive grey area where there aren't actual hard and fast rules. There's like what this could look like and what it couldn't look like, but it's tricky because there will be lots of scenarios where clients are and have done for a really long time legitimately used consultancy firms and other types of organisations to provide them with fully contracted out services. And the IR35 reform has sort of created an industry within an industry that sort of lets organisations or perhaps pushes organisations to engage with something that they actually potentially don't need or that isn't relevant to them because actually what they need is resource.
Labour.
Yeah, exactly. And that their risk decisions and people coming along with suggesting, okay, we've got this IR35 compliant solution, or you don't need to worry about IR35, we'll take responsibility of that for you, that people say, well, if this is something that takes the risk away, I'm quite happy with that, and we've seen a lot of that in the public sector reform, especially as well.
Yeah, and it carried through into the private sector very much as well, and it was almost sort of positioned as that sort of magic wand in a lot of cases to remove an IR35 burden or exposure for the recipient of the services.
Do you think it was purposely contrived by many in that respect?
Yeah, I think that is fair to say. I think it's one of those where people were presented with a problem around IR35. There was a recognition they were going to have to change how they were working, and some viewed this as a potential solution. And to be clear, in some cases it was legitimate. There were ways to transition away from a pure resource provision to a legitimate managed service structure that would be suitable and completely removes the IR35 burden from the hirer. But I think there is that degree of trying to shoehorn a structure around what their requirements are, and that's where it does get dangerous. Ultimately, if a end user of services needs bums on seats, just needs headcount and filling roles, then really a contracted out service is never going to be suitable for that, and that structure actually then appears to be masking or disguising who's responsible from an IR35 perspective, which is obviously dangerous. And I think it's probably worth going into a bit more detail there about what those those outcomes could be. So if I'm a hirer and I deal with a provider who said that, yeah, we'll structure this as a contracted out service and therefore we're taking responsibility from an IR35 perspective, if HMRC were to look at that and actually determine that this isn't a legitimate contracted out service, what do we think the next steps would then be for HMRC? How would they approach that?
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to see, because obviously it is a question that is coming at it is speculative to an extent, but you would expect the first the first thought from HMRC's point of view is the fact that the client hasn't, the ultimate engager hasn't taken reasonable care. They've not fulfilled their obligations.
And may have not even done a status determination at all.
Which is likely. They probably haven't. They probably said, "Oh, fine. You're a contracted out service." And that's it. They've not thought any more about it. So there is, that will immediately, if there is a lack of reasonable care, a lack of discharge of their obligations, that immediately puts all of the risk and the financial risk back on the ultimate engager. Obviously, the thing that I find it quite difficult to explain sometimes when people are asking about contracted out services is that there's a big difference between, is it a contracted out service, and then is it inside or outside I-35?
Yes.
Those are two distinct, very distinct. And often you find people confusing the terminology and saying as contracted out service, it falls outside of the I-35 rules or outside the scope of the off-payroll rules. No. So there's a process involved. So obviously, if HMRC find that it isn't a contracted out services and it is a provision of labour, that doesn't necessarily mean that I-35 applies or the off-payroll rules.
No, in
apply
theory, the workers themselves could be outside IR35 and actually there isn't a liability there.
Well, HMRC, this is one of we've spoken about this before. They're really not going to do in that situation.
No, but I mean, ultimately, if the workers are legitimately self-employed, they're they're taking financial risk, they've got a right of substitution, they've got good control over their services, and are textbook self-employed, well, it's kind of hard to then apply any kind of remedial action there. I suppose the difficulty comes in managing that dispute and having to go through that process with HMRC, particularly in this early stage after implementation of the off-payroll rules. That's going to be a real headache for firms.
One of the things that also potentially makes that full thing even more complicated is if between the supplier and the client both parties agree, okay, as far as we're concerned, this is a genuinely contracted out service. They can demonstrate that they've taken a level of due diligence in arriving at that, and then the supplier to the client actually then undertakes the relevant status determinations of the workers. So in theory, everyone has done everything correctly on paper. HMRC can still come in and challenge that, say that they disagree with the determination around the actual assessment as to whether it's a contracted out service. Workers have already been determined. They still could be legitimately inside or outside IR35. So then it makes it all the more complicated in terms of, well, actually, as far as what the expectations that HMRC have, everyone has done everything that they actually should have done. They've made a determination on the actual arrangement between the client and the supplier. Individual assessments have been undertaken on the workers. But HMRC can still come along and challenge that as well.
I think another interesting angle on that is also around the small business exemption. Because actually, if the contracted out service provider is actually exempt from the IR35 rules by virtue of being a small business,
which has happened quite a lot. Actually.
Which does happen.
The ones that we see will be small consultancies,
and I think particularly the ones that have been set up specifically to circumvent the IR35 burden will probably fall into that category as well. So in those cases, obviously where the small business exemption applies, then maybe those determinations won't have been done. The worker in those cases would have the primary responsibility in theory, but if that is challenged and found not to be true by HMRC, well, no one's carried out a status determination, and that's deeply problematic.
So if you are a large client, then you have a contingent labour population that sits over here. You've got a couple of hundred PSAs. You have a procurement function. Your procurement function engages lots of different types of suppliers across your entire organisation. How do you actually manage your compliance with what is a very, very specific part of the overall off-payroll rules?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I guess when the reform came in, people would have, within a large client, would have been given the unenviable task of dealing with, their I-35 off-payroll obligations, which would largely be focused on that contingent labour, on that contingent workforce, the time and materials workers that were provided by their PSL of agencies or whatever. So they, and as you say, you've got, HR, whoever over here, procurement over there. It is often very difficult for a business to have that, to get a handle on, or to really understand that there's potentially this hidden risk over there. So I think there's an education piece that's required within organisations to say, well, hang on a minute, you need to bridge this gap. There is potentially this risk.
And while we keep coming back to a lot of this being untested, actually we can say with quite a lot of certainty the cases that we have seen unfolding so far on the off-payroll side of things, HMRC have specifically asked for lists of those types of suppliers. And chapter and verse, so everything from the gardener to the guy who brings the water bottles into the water coolers. They will want a list of everyone. And if contracted out services where it's disguised have just fallen into a different pot, actually that could be a nasty surprise for a business who may not even realise that these workers have been engaged on that basis. So the foresight is a key bit there for agencies for hirers.
Yeah. I mean, one of the annoying things with this is that we are referring to them as contracted out services here, but there isn't really a clear and easy piece of terminology that you can use. And we have this trouble internally. We're saying, well, hang on a minute, what are we calling these things?
Is it a contracted out service? Is it a managed service?
Yeah, MSP, which obviously means something very different.
How do
Statement
you
of
say
work. Yeah. So there isn't. It doesn't really have a brand yet, does it?
No. I mean, maybe this podcast will help. Contracted out services. Are we sticking with that, or do we want to give it a new name?
And that is now eventually the kind of terminology that HMRC has landed at with it. But there is still a massive gap from an education perspective and even in HMRC's guidance. So in December, we had the updated guidance piece. There's a specific section on contracted out services and over 10 pages. It gives you some somewhat confusing examples of how to think about contracted out services that probably don't exist in a real way for clients, because I think one of the things that we need to be kind of mindful of here is this exposure and risk only exists if there are PSCs in the supply chain. If there aren't any and the supplier is providing that service to the client and using solely their employees, there is no risk.
And I've got to say, if we talk about HMRC's guidance, and the fact that it only becomes an issue if there's PSCs involved, HMRC's examples, and we've got them here. I haven't revised on them recently, but obviously they had an example of, I think it was an IT consultant or an IT delivery of IT services, which they said was a contracted out service. Yeah. On the other side, it was like refuse collectors, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was. So,
yeah.
To give an example, it seems ridiculous that HMRC's, they chose refuse collectors or a recycling company.
Not a pragmatic example at all.
No, especially if what you actually need to illustrate is a real-life example where there is a potential that there could be PSCs in the supply chain.
Exactly.
Because a lot of the conversations that we've certainly had with clients, and we've gone through several different types of exercises with different organisations, from sitting with procurement teams and actually categorising suppliers into where there is likely a potential pool of PSCs in the supply chain. So to your gardeners, people providing your water.
I don't know why I thought about the water bottles guy. He's almost as bad as the HMRC example. Terrible.
Well, but I think that's the thing, is that because the guidance isn't clear. So I went through it, as I do when I prep for these things, went through earlier. And that first example that you talked about, HMRC actually doesn't mention in the guidance anything to do with PSCs.
No.
It just says, based on this assessment of this particular nature of the relationship between the local authority and this waste refuse company, it's a legitimate contracted out service. Doesn't talk about there being PSCs in the supply chain. Doesn't talk about the fact that actually, even when you make that assessment, as a client, from a best practice perspective, what you should actually really want to do is make sure that you understand that supplier's IR35 process, so that you can be confident that they're actually in turn discharging their IR35 responsibilities.
Yeah, no wonder people don't understand it.
It's a rough one.
So, I mean, if we think, we've obviously mentioned that consultancies. Consultancies, historically, typically are going to be the types of organisations who are going to be the providers, deliverers of these contracts out services. Where do recruiters fit into all of this?
So I think in some cases we've seen recruiters set up consultancy specifically for this purpose, which, again, if it's set up as a workaround, it immediately rings some alarm bells. And it was actually a point that Nick picked up on earlier, was one of my sort of bugbears with the structure, is that contractually speaking, when that consultancy is providing that service, then you would expect, under the model that you were talking about, a traditional consultancy, they have the expertise to be able to deliver that service. They don't have a business without that. If it's a recruitment agency that is then setting up that consultancy purely to structure a contracted out service, it's actually very unlikely that that agency is going to have in-house expertise to deliver what that service is designed to be. That opens up a large degree of contractual liability, because contractually they will be responsible for that service, and it's impossible for them to have oversight over the delivery, let alone the quality or the just the general ability to deliver a specialist service. Now, that's not to say that there are no examples of recruiters who've set up consultancies and then brought that type of expertise in, but actually I think that is rare. I think in a lot of cases where those structures have been set up, there isn't the internal knowledge to be a legitimate service provider, and I actually think HMRC could focus on that if they were challenging the status to say, how can this business legitimately hold itself out to be a consultancy when the staff are PSCs that you've drafted in to fill roles in a third-party organisation.
And from a obviously, as kind of the insurance expert around the table, have you
Stop.
have you had that type of conversation with an organisation who's coming to look for insurance? They've structured something where it's we've got statement of work. Have you had that difficult conversation where you're saying, hang on a minute, do you realise that you're taking on a significant amount of risk?
Multiple times, And to be fair, that is actually a point that oftentimes does walk things back through that structure, and then we will end up in a position where actually it's a traditional supply of staff. It's a PSC contractor assessed by the end hirer, and the structure isn't necessary. So when it gets that level of scrutiny, absolutely. I think it's also an interesting sort of dichotomy, because under a general insurance principles for recruitment agencies, and controlling that contractual risk is a big part of minimising their exposure to claims. It's not unusual for recruiters to incur a liability for the actions of the workers that they're placing, but when you are primarily the service provider, that's the next level of liability. Obviously, there is then a requirement for the contractors to carry their own insurance, and claims can get a little complex depending on who's responsible. But it's a needless exercise to have to go through. When it's a black and white position that a hirer wants a body, then you put a contractor into that space, then you've fulfilled your role as a recruiter. So
And if we're going back to the point on consultancies, let's say we are a consultancy. We've been providing services like this for a long time. What we have seen is some engagers, some client organisations saying, don't care what you are. If there's PSC, this is flipping everything on its head. But don't care what you are. If there are PSCs involved, they're inside. They've got to go through an umbrella company. So there's been an element of kind of unfairness, I guess, for a lot of consultancies who have always legitimately done. They take on all the risk. They manage the work. They manage the projects. They engage contractors, and I think a lot of them have been kind of caught in the crosshairs, or they've been, there's been some damage there because some clients have just said, no, you need to use umbrella companies.
It's all the ultra-orthodox blanket ban, isn't it? It's not just your own engagement with contractors, but banning across the supply chain.
Yeah. And then if we look at it from a contractor's point of view, I suppose one thing to cover off here is that this, if we're talking about terminology, statement of work, that's come up so many times. And I think, again, it's like, what do you mean? What are you talking about when you're talking about a statement of work? But I think you often find contractors talking about a statement of work. And saying, that means I'm outside I-35. It doesn't.
No, it does not. So a statement of work is a schedule, an appendix, and part of an overall contract that exists between a contract. If we're talking about contractors here, between the contractor and either a recruitment agency or the consultancy firm that's engaged them to provide the services. That statement of work might outline some details around why what the contractor has been engaged to provide from a service perspective. there might be some milestones in there. There might be some deliverables. There might be some information around kind of the financial aspects around those deliverables and milestones. Equally, I have also seen statements of work that just look like a time and materials schedule.
Yeah.
So as a individual piece of paper, it doesn't actually mean anything. Even if a contractor is engaged on a kind of deliverables basis, it doesn't automatically mean that they're outside of IR35.
No.
And I think that organisations out there spend a huge amount of time and money and effort in trying to establish what is a structure that exists at a consultancy level. So client to consultancy, milestones, deliverables, that milestone-based payments all make sense because you're often delivering a large piece of work. Contractors working as part of that, sometimes it's actually very difficult to specifically define the part that they are individually delivering. They are contributing to it, and they can contribute to that on a time and materials basis and still be outside of IR35. And that's the challenge that we have seen, is that lots of organisations sort of created this little cottage industry of documentation and process because they thought that they had to, because they thought that that would be a legitimate way to strengthen outside of IR35 positions, when sometimes it didn't, and it was actually wholly unnecessary as well.
Exactly, and it's that whole, just because a piece of paper has got a statement of work written on the top of it, that isn't, that's no meaningful indicator one way or another. The ironic thing underneath all of that, though, is that actually, a genuine statement of work that sets out on a contractor's level those key deliverables and what they're responsible for, if those are in place, well, it's a positive step towards being outside of IR35.
Fixed price work, if they're taking on that financial risk.
There can be some really strong practices
but
within
I think
that.
people conflate that question with the question of whether something is genuinely contracted out.
That's it.
We're not saying contractors providing. That's not a contracted out service in the same way that we're talking about. So
but it may very well be outside IR35,
Exactly.
which is ultimately the goal that a lot of these structures are set up to achieve.
Yeah.
So it can be a bit confounding in that respect.
Very much so. And then from a contractor's point of view, let's say they're working for a consultancy who says, I'm a small company, so no need to worry about, we don't need to do a determination on you. Is there a bit of a hidden risk that contractors don't realise that they actually have that potential?
If it's poorly communicated, absolutely.
Because basically, if a contractor is working for a small company, then the old-fashioned IR35 applies, meaning that contractors are responsible for determining their status.
Yeah, and I think the other thing as well is, if it is a legitimate contracted out service, the way in which a consultancy can engage a contractor could technically be more akin to inside IR35 working than outside IR35 working, because that consultancy needs to have more control over the full service provision between us and a client, and indirectly a result of that, especially if there's a mixture of employees and contractors doing that piece of work, that control sort of filters further down in the service delivery as well. So I think that there is a bit of it creates a bit of a confusing space for contractors potentially, but they absolutely should still consider their own IR35 status and engage with their consultancy if there are practices that they see creeping in that actually could allude to the fact that they are operating more akin to an employee as opposed to self-employed.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So what should a consultancy do? What should somebody who's looking to provide contracted out services? Let's say they're not looking to do it from the perspective of I-35. They are genuinely looking to set up as a consultancy. Where do they go? And what steps do you take to make sure that you are?
I mean, it's very, very difficult because, as we know, there's not specific rules on that. And ultimately, if you are setting up a legitimate consultancy there, then your setups are probably more dictated by the industry that you're working in and the requirements of your client than they are by a tax position. You would like to think that if you are responding to those requirements, and it is, again, from the basis of a legitimate contracted out services, not just resource provision, that actually that will inherently instill positive factors that will demonstrate that you are providing a legitimate consultancy service. Whether or not that holds true under scrutiny from HMRC, we don't know at this point. But yeah, having an eye on that tax position. So if you are responsible for the IR35 determinations, i.e. not small business exempt, then having methods and mechanisms to do that in the same way any hiring organisation would is a necessary point. And taking sensible decisions about how you engage your workers. We've come back to it that in a lot of cases there are just full-time employees that work for these types of consultancy businesses. Yeah. So you would then need to scrutinise, why do you need a PSC? Do you yourself have a legitimate need for a PSC contractor, or do you actually want another employee? You've got to view it from the perspective of a hirer rather than a recruiter, which, if the consultancy's been set up by a recruiter, can be quite a difficult mindset shift.
Yeah, I think making sure as well that the key thing is you probably need to be a consultant first before you become a consultancy, i.e. you should have a specialist set of skills, technical or otherwise, depending on what type of industry that you work in, so that you actually have the foundation to be able to deliver that type of service into a client organisation, and ultimately realistically think of how best do you deliver that type of service practically. How do you engage with your client? What is your bid process? What's your discovery and scoping process with the client? How do you set out your deliverables? What does your statement of work look like? How can you actually engage with your client to get to the point of meeting their needs for whatever it is that you're wanting to do with them, and then how you actually structure that financially, and in turn how you actually correctly resource it as well. And I said it earlier that the contractual position needs to be reflective of the reality. And like we've said this a lot before, whether something is or is not a contracted out service isn't an issue. People can engage consultants to provide resources if they need to. That is an okay practice. Equally, people can compliantly engage organisations to provide fully contracted out service. The issue is if the organisations entering into that arrangement together haven't undertaken the right type of due diligence to make an assertion on the nature of the relationship between the two of them, and that if there are PSCs in the supply chain, the correct party is picking up that responsibility for managing the IR35 rules. That's as simple as what it is, and I think it's so easy for all the parties in the supply chain in this kind of concern that the IR35 reform created around this specific part of the market is unnecessary, because you can actually manage it compliantly. And we've talked a lot about the complexities of what it is and what it isn't, what's good practice and what's bad practice. But ultimately, by undertaking a bit of due diligence, and sometimes that might need to come in the form of some external advice, ultimately there is a proper agreed process for considering the nature of the engagement and making sure that whichever party in the supply chain fulfills the relevant IR35 obligations that they've got.
I think describing it as needless is 100% correct, but I think in some cases we can go further than that, in that when these structures are put in place specifically to remove an IR35 exposure from the hirer, it can be counterproductive. It's not, it's not a non-issue. It actually increases the risk or the potential exposures that a hirer would have. I mean, in terms of a sort of a key takeaway from today, I think actually to Nick's point, the separation of contracted out services from IR35 as two separate and distinct issues is probably one of the key messages that we can give today,
absolutely,
really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But obviously they are often viewed in concert. I think. I mean, it's good. Where do you think we'll be in 12 months' time? Do you think will there be? I don't think we're going to get any better guidance.
I wouldn't have thought so.
No, I think we might get some case law precedent within a year. That will be the case, and hopefully that's not anything too scary. But we just don't know at this point.
Okay.
Good note to end on. Don't know. Do not know.
It's a cliffhanger.
Tune back in next year.
All right. Well, thank you very much for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another guest. So please subscribe to our channels to get updated immediately, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.